NBC got a story that would have put America's best detective up against a killer who had no reason to kill. In 1973, NBC received a Columbo script that was unlike anything they had seen before. It wasn't the usual story with a clever slayer and a quiet detective. The story was darker than anything the show had ever done, and the network didn't like it. They said it was too disturbing for television, and that viewers weren't ready to see something like this. But that explanation wasn't honest. The real reason this episode was never shown had more to do with what the story revealed than with how dark it was. This episode was not only rejected, but was hidden. And now, after 50 years, the truth about why it disappeared is finally being revealed. The writers' strike and a clever loophole. Back in the early 1960s, Hollywood ground to a halt when a writers' strike left many in the industry scrambling for work. Among them were two screenwriters, Richard Levinson and William Link, who found themselves struggling to make ends meet. Instead of waiting for the strike to end, they decided to exploit a little-known loophole in the strike restrictions. They realized that live TV was exempt from the strike rules, so they jumped at the opportunity. Determined to make something work, they hastily wrote a murder mystery for NBC's new live color show, The Chevy Mystery Show. The script was rushed, desperate even, and they even tricked their agent to get it sold. What resulted was a scrappy but incredibly impactful creation, a detective named Lieutenant Columbo. It was a last-ditch effort that would forever change pop culture. Lieutenant Columbo wasn't even entirely original. Levinson and Link were deeply inspired by Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment and the character of Porfiry Petrovich, a detective who appeared unassuming but was, in fact, a brilliant investigator. That quiet, almost harmless appearance is exactly what they wanted for Columbo. Instead of following the typical murder mystery format of hiding the slayer until the end, they chose to reveal the slayer right from the start. The suspense, then, wasn't about discovering who the slayer was. It was about watching Columbo slowly unravel the truth through his odd quirks and sharp questions. It was a fresh approach that struck a chord with audiences. But the first ever Columbo wasn't played by Peter Falk. On July 31, 1960, the character was brought to life by Bert Freed in a live broadcast. Freed's performance was solid, but it was just a stepping stone. The real magic, as we know, was still years away. 2 years later, Levinson and Link turned enough rope into a stage play called Prescription Murder, with Thomas Mitchell stepping into the role of Columbo. Though the play didn't make it to Broadway, it still captivated audiences, marking Mitchell's final role before his death. The stage production was a turning point, but television was where Columbo would truly take off. In 1968, NBC decided to adapt Prescription Murder into a TV movie. This time, the role of Columbo went to Peter Falk. Interestingly, he wasn't the network's first choice. Both Lee J. Cobb and Bing Crosby passed on the role. But Falk, with his strange charm and razor-sharp focus, was perfect for the part. In this first film, Columbo was still somewhat clean-cut. His hair was neat and his suit was pressed. The iconic raincoat made its debut, though, and it stuck around for the long haul. That raincoat, by the way, wasn't some random piece of wardrobe. Peter Falk had purchased it himself during a rainstorm in New York for just $15. He wore it in the movie. And then, somehow, it became part of his permanent look. The coat was made by a high-end Spanish company, but to Falk, it wasn't about brand names. It was about the look. He even started bringing his own clothes to set, ensuring that Columbo's wardrobe reflected his character's unique, unpretentious nature. The shoes, the suits, and even the car. Nothing about Columbo screamed typical detective. He didn't have that polished, sharp look that most TV detectives flaunted. No, Columbo was scruffy and unrefined. Right down to the old Peugeot he insisted on driving. The character wasn't dressed up by a costume team to create some glossy, unrealistic persona. Instead, Columbo's look was part of what made him so relatable, so real. He wasn't a detective you'd find in a glamorous world of fiction. He was a guy who looked like he had just come from an all-night stakeout and hadn't bothered to change. But what truly made Columbo fascinating wasn't just his unkempt appearance, it was the way Peter Falk played him. Falk wasn't merely acting, he was playing a mind game with everyone around him. He often veered off script, getting distracted in the middle of scenes, and it wasn't just for fun. It was to throw the actors, especially the ones playing the suspects, off balance. He might pull out a shopping list instead of evidence, or casually ask to borrow a pencil for no reason. The mystery of Columbo's name. The actors who played the guilty parties were often caught off guard. They'd look irritated, nervous, just like their characters should. Meanwhile, the audience were in on it. Watching Columbo throw these offhand tricks felt like we were invited into a special club where we knew exactly what he was up to, but the suspects didn't. That gave the show an entirely different layer of enjoyment. Columbo was pulling off a long con, and we loved every second of it.
Oh, one more thing. The next time you see me.
And then, there's the line. Just one more thing. It's become Columbo's signature, the phrase that fans associate with the detective. But here's the thing. It wasn't some grand plan. It wasn't a stroke of genius. It was a last-minute fix. The creators, Levinson and Link, admitted that the line came about because they needed to fill a scene that was running too short. So, in a hasty attempt to extend it without retyping, they had Columbo turn back into the room and say, "Just one more thing." What began as a lazy solution turned into one of the most iconic moments in television history. The line became Columbo's trademark, signaling the moment when the Slayer's fate was sealed. Another unique aspect of Columbo was the mystery surrounding his name. In all those years of the show, viewers never truly knew his first name. Occasionally, you might catch a glimpse of Frank Columbo on a blurry badge, but the creators intentionally kept his first name out of the script. They wanted him to remain an enigma, a character that wasn't defined by a name, but by his actions. The myth of Columbo's name was so potent that even a trivia writer, Fred Worth, created a fake first name for the detective, Philip Columbo, in an attempt to catch copycats. Trivial Pursuit fell for it, and when Worth sued the game, he lost. But the myth still stuck, lingering in pop culture like a piece of trivia no one could shake. At Columbo's nephew's wedding, everyone just called him Lieutenant. Imagine that, going through life and having your family avoid calling you by your first name. The name Columbo itself had become so iconic, so inseparable from the character, that it wasn't even necessary to know his full name. It was the one mystery they could leave unsolved. Behind the scenes, casting the guest stars for each episode was just as intense as creating Columbo himself. The team considered dozens of actors to play the Slayers in each story. Some of Hollywood's biggest names were even considered for roles. Orson Welles and Peter Sellers were among the stars looked at for certain parts. However, Sellers demanded so much money that they had to pass it on to him. Falk himself had veto power over some casting choices. He didn't give an explanation when he rejected Danny Kaye, but the point was clear. He wasn't going to let just anyone play opposite him. When it comes to launching a detective show, the hero needs to show up fast. People need to be hooked right away, or else they'll switch the channel. But the creators of Columbo, Richard Levinson and William Link, didn't care about the rules. They flipped the script and made the audience wait nearly 30 minutes before Columbo even appeared. It was the longest stage wait in television history at that time, and executives thought viewers would lose interest and change the channel. But what happened next changed everything. Instead of the usual whodunit formula, Columbo revealed the Slayer right at the start. You saw the slaying happen. You watched the meticulous plan unfold, And then you just had to sit back and wait to see how Columbo would unravel it all. It wasn't about the mystery of who did it, but how he would catch them. It became a game of strategy, not suspense. A detective who didn't use guns or car chases. The tension didn't disappear just because we knew who the slayer was. In fact, it added another layer. Watching Columbo slowly chip away at the slayer's perfect plan was far more satisfying than any car chase or shootout could ever be. Columbo didn't rely on flashy action scenes. Instead, he used polite questions, everyday logic, and an uncanny attention to tiny details. A smudge on a wine glass? A thermostat set too low? These were the little things that would trip up even the most confident criminals. But what truly set Columbo apart was the way he operated in a world full of the wealthy and powerful. Columbo wasn't rich. He didn't wear fancy suits or drive a sleek car. His coat was always wrinkled, his cigars were cheap, and he had a tendency to ramble about his wife in the most awkward, endearing way. He didn't look like the sort of person who could topple a CEO or a surgeon, but that was the point. The criminals Columbo went after were always people who thought they were untouchable, people in high positions who believed their wealth and status would protect them from the law. Columbo, though, never treated them like they were special. He didn't show them any respect simply because of their wealth. In fact, he made them uncomfortable. He'd casually ask about the cost of their expensive paintings or mention that his wife had something similar at home just to see how they'd react. These small interactions exposed the uncomfortable truth. The rich assumed they were untouchable, but Columbo wasn't afraid to knock them off their pedestals. NBC didn't initially understand what they had. After a few episodes, the network pushed the creators to change the format. They wanted Columbo to show up earlier and for the storytelling to be more traditional. But Levinson, Link, producer William Furman, and even Peter Falk stood their ground. They weren't going to compromise their vision. In fact, they threatened to quit rather than change the heart of the show. It was a risky move, but it paid off. The gamble worked, and viewers loved the unconventional format. Ratings soared, and the network backed off. From the moment Columbo premiered on September 15, 1971, it was clear this show was different. Though it shared a time slot with other detective shows as part of NBC's mystery movie rotation, Columbo quickly became the fan favorite, proving that sometimes breaking the rules is the best way to stand out. Peter Falk's portrayal of Columbo was the heart and soul of the show, and it didn't take long for the world to notice. In fact, his performance was so compelling that he won an Emmy for the role during that first season, followed by 4 more Emmys over the years, plus a Golden Globe.
And the winner is Peter Falk, Columbo.
Falk didn't rely on flashy moves or exaggerated gestures. His charm was messy, his delivery meticulous, and he turned Columbo into a character who felt completely real. He didn't need to shout or put on a show. Instead, he would just ask one more thing, and with that simple phrase, the entire investigation would turn on its head. The show's format shift and its success. NBC's decision to rotate Columbo with other shows gave it a longer runtime, often up to 90 minutes. This allowed the writers to build tension, develop characters, and give the plot room to breathe. It made Columbo feel more like a movie than a typical TV episode, and that pacing worked wonders. Viewers weren't just watching a crime being solved, they were experiencing the slow, meticulous unraveling of a criminal's perfect plan. The show was so successful that NBC moved it to Sunday nights, making it a primetime staple. What no one expected, though, was how far Columbo would go. It wasn't just a hit in the US, it became a global phenomenon. Syndicated in 44 countries, it gained an international fan base. In Hungary, a statue of Columbo was even erected. In Romania, fans were so devastated when the show ended that Peter Falk had to record a special message to let them know it wasn't a result of censorship, it was just over. Columbo wasn't just popular in the moment, it became a classic. The BBC, decades later, still called it timeless. The character's quiet persistence, his unshakable sense of justice, and the pure satisfaction of seeing arrogant criminals get what they deserved resonated with audiences everywhere. Columbo was a symbol of what justice could be, and that message crossed borders. Even the show's guest stars were a testament to its allure. Major actors lined up to play slayers, turning catching slayers into a coveted role. Jack Cassidy did it 3 times. William Shatner appeared twice. Patrick McGoohan earned Emmys for his guest roles. The list didn't stop there. Leonard Nimoy, Robert Culp, George Hamilton, and Martin Landau all appeared, often in memorable, complex roles.
In 1973, a script surfaced at NBC that dared to take a beloved television detective into uncharted territory.
Columbo didn't just attract the best actors. It also lured some of Hollywood's biggest behind-the-scenes names. A 24-year-old Steven Spielberg directed the first regular episode, and Peter Falk immediately saw that Spielberg was too talented for a show like Columbo. That wasn't the only big name to join the team. In the summer of 1973, something truly unexpected happened. Brian De Palma, a rising director known for his disdain for television, decided to write an episode for Columbo. This was the same De Palma who had just released Sisters, a dark thriller that showcased his love for Hitchcock-style storytelling. But Columbo had impressed him so much that he teamed up with his friend Jay Cox, a respected film critic, to write a script. They even used a fake name for Cox, borrowing Joseph P. Gillis from Sunset Boulevard, as though they were in on a private joke. What made it even more remarkable was that this all happened during a writer's strike when the show was desperately in need of content. De Palma, who typically looked down on television, saw something different in this scruffy detective show, and he wanted to be a part of it. The story they came up with was wild, full of twists and turns, and a reflection of the very spirit of Columbo. The dark art of filmmaker Quentyn Lee, in an episode that took Columbo to unexpected, darker places, a filmmaker named Quentyn Lee, clearly inspired by real-life figures like Truman Capote, plans and executes the slaying of a talk show host, filming the entire event. Lee wanted to prove that a crime without a clear motive could be the perfect crime. He had no interest in the typical revenge or money-driven slayings that populated other detective stories. No, Lee's crime was an artistic experiment, a demonstration of his twisted philosophy. Lee, in his delusion, selects a victim by throwing a dart at a list of celebrities who live in his building. He lands on someone he deems cheap and fake, calling them a public zircon, a fake diamond with no real value. It was a disturbingly cold choice, and as his plan unfolded, it became even more bizarre. Lee decided to make a documentary about the slaying, with one crucial twist. He would include Columbo himself in the footage, without the detective knowing. Suddenly, things got meta. The story within a story started to take shape when 3 film students, one of them named Spielberg, began following Columbo with cameras. The reference to Spielberg here wasn't subtle. This was a wink to the real Steven Spielberg, who had directed an episode of Columbo earlier. The show's ability to break the fourth wall was part of what made it stand out, even before it fully realized it. But timing was a factor that would complicate things further. The timing of this storyline wasn't ideal for Columbo. A writer's strike had left the show behind schedule, and producers were scrambling to get content out. Another script, Double Exposure, written by Stephen J. Kell, was submitted during the strike. It was a faster and easier script to shoot, involving a villain who used subliminal images to commit slaying. While it wasn't as complex as De Palma's script, it was much more manageable given the tight production timeline. De Palma's script, which involved intricate visual tricks and multi-layered storytelling, would have pushed the boundaries of what Columbo had done before. But it was just too complicated to execute under the circumstances. Despite this, the producers were intrigued by it and even liked some aspects of it more than other episodes that ultimately made it to air. De Palma's vision, with its complex narrative and visual flair, was impressive, but it wasn't what Columbo needed at that moment. The production team did, however, borrow elements from De Palma's script for later episodes. The idea of film students following Columbo with cameras appeared in Mind Over Mayhem, though the character of Steven Spielberg was slightly altered, clearly a nod to the original script. But the real issue wasn't just about borrowing ideas. The true challenge was in Columbo's tone. Columbo had a formula. The Slayer was usually someone with a clear, selfish motive: money, power, revenge, something relatable. De Palma's villain didn't fit that mold at all. He wasn't motivated by anything as mundane as money. Instead, he was driven by the desire to turn slaying into art, to commit the perfect crime as a form of self-expression. This wasn't a villain who wanted to get away with slaying for personal gain. He was after something more philosophical, something cold and unsettling. This approach reminded viewers of Hitchcock's Rope, where the slayers believed they were intellectually superior, above suspicion, and above reproach. But that type of character didn't belong in the world of Columbo. The producers likely feared that audiences wouldn't connect with such a distant, emotionless character. De Palma's typical themes, watching people through cameras, blurring the lines between reality and performance, were powerful, but they were a bit too abstract for a show like Columbo, which thrived on the comfort of familiar detective tropes and predictable outcomes. Peter Falk's directorial struggles. In the early days, Columbo had a formula that worked like clockwork. The Slayer was always revealed right at the start, leaving the audience to watch as Columbo's slow, methodical, and polite detective work unraveled the case. It was never about who committed the crime, but how Columbo would catch them. But over time, the series began to stretch the boundaries of what was expected. The twists and turns started to get more unconventional. In 1992, Columbo took a sharp detour with No Time to Die, which felt more like a horror movie than anything the series had done before. Gone was the usual calm investigation. Instead, the episode was filled with panic, screaming, chloroform, and a disturbing kidnapping during a honeymoon. It was a fast-paced, high-intensity ride, with Columbo teaming up with a police unit holding a gun and racing against time. The final moments, involving a shootout, were a far cry from the cerebral, quiet finales fans had come to expect. Some viewers called it bold, but most deemed it the worst episode the show had ever seen. When Columbo returned to TV in 1989 after an 11-year hiatus, the show went even further off the rails.
Columbo, the slow-talking, cigar-chomping detective in the rumpled raincoat, has been a favorite of television audiences since actor Peter Falk first ambled onto the screen.
The episode Murder, Smoke, and Shadows was a Hollywood-themed outing that leaned heavily into absurd theatricality. The villain was a young, flashy film director who came off more as a parody of Steven Spielberg than a serious threat. There was even a scene where Columbo wobbled on a waterbed for over 10 minutes, stretching the comedic angle to an uncomfortable degree. The grand reveal was equally over the top, with police officers dramatically popping out in costumes, complete with spotlights and music like something out of a stage production. The whole thing felt more like a joke than a mystery. Still, Compared to some of the show's later revivals, some fans defended it as a quirky throwback to the show's more whimsical days. But things took a stranger turn that same year with Murder, a self-portrait. This time, instead of piecing together physical clues, Columbo had to interpret bizarre dream sequences recorded by the victim. The dreams were filled with surreal images, meat in a sink, pocket watches in teacups, and even a French uncle who somehow symbolized Monl. It was symbolic, psychological, and confusing all at once. The Slayer was a narcissistic artist living with both his current and former wives, and the plot leaned heavily into these strange, almost abstract concepts. Columbo seemed to possess an uncanny psychological insight, suddenly more like a therapist than a detective. The supposed repressed memories were revealed to be fake, adding another layer of chaos to the already convoluted storyline. Despite the confusion, the final portrait of the Slayer left a lasting impact, even if the plot had barely made sense. By 2003, Columbo had somehow found itself investigating raves. Yes, raves. The final episode ever made tried to drag the rumpled detective into the 21st century, placing him in the neon lights, loud music, and sweaty crowds of a nightclub scene. Gone were the quiet living rooms and cigar smoke. Columbo now wore a feather boa and wandered through nightclubs in search of clues. At one point, he even retrieved a toenail clipping from a toilet by hand. The case involved a cover-up, a slaying, and a tabloid journalist. But the real spectacle was how out of place Columbo seemed in this world of flashing lights and thumping beats. Some fans appreciated the attempt to modernize the character, but for many others, it felt like a jarring departure from the show's iconic style. It was awkward, surreal, and oddly fascinating, but most viewers couldn't help but long for the Columbo of the old days. Not all missteps in Columbo's later years were deliberately bizarre. Back in 1972, Peter Falk had the chance to direct an episode called Blueprint for Murder. The production was a mess. Falk was frustrated with the producers, who handed him an episode set at a real construction site, making an already difficult task even harder. To make things worse, the studio refused to pay for extras, so Falk ended up covering the costs himself. He even called up Spielberg and his other contacts for help. The result was a mixed bag. The episode was uneven, a reflection of the challenges Falk faced during the shoot, but it did offer an insight into the creative struggles of the time. The show was beginning to feel the weight of its success and the strain of maintaining its formula. And not all of it was pretty behind the scenes. The End of Columbo. When Peter Falk played Columbo in Columbo Likes the Nightlife in 2003, fans were ready to say goodbye. It seemed like the end of an era. Falk had aged, and the show had already taken some strange turns in its later years. But behind the scenes, Universal Studios wasn't ready to let go just yet. In 2007, they quietly began working on one final episode, a farewell that would close the chapter on the iconic detective. The working title was Hear No Evil, but it was soon renamed Columbo's Last Case, making it clear that this wasn't just another mystery, and it was going to be a send-off. By this time, Falk was nearing 80. He wasn't interested in fading quietly into the background. He wanted to go out with dignity, one last time in that rumpled coat that had made him a household name. A full 102-page script was written, carefully crafted to bring Columbo's story to a close in the right way. It was a fitting tribute to a character who had become a cultural touchstone. The timing couldn't have been better. The script was set to air on the 40th anniversary of Columbo's first appearance in 1968. The story was a classic mix of modern intrigue and the psychological twists that the show was famous for. It centered around a high-tech slaying committed with sound something that felt fresh and contemporary, but still grounded in Columbo's world. A tiny clicking sound, barely audible, was the first clue. It was the kind of thing only Columbo would notice, and it slowly unraveled the Slayer's carefully laid plans. In a nod to the past, the script also included a cameo from Larry King, playing himself. This was supposed to be a fun callback to the days when celebrities like Johnny Cash and Janet Leigh made surprise appearances on the show. It was a gesture that said, "This is Columbo, the way you remember him." When Universal Studios first began planning Columbo's last case, the idea seemed like the perfect way to wrap up the detective's story. Falk, now in his late 70s, was ready to don the rumpled coat one last time. The script had everything: an intriguing modern mystery with psychological twists, a cameo by Larry King, and a story that would bring Columbo back to his roots. However, the network, ABC, wasn't on board. Despite Columbo's immense popularity, the idea of an 80-year-old man leading a TV movie was too much for the network to stomach. Charles Engel, an executive at ABC, bluntly stated, "No one wants to buy a movie with an 80-year-old lead." The project was stalled. Universal tried to reach out to overseas investors, hoping the international appeal of the beloved detective might be enough to push it forward. But without the backing of a major U.S. network, the momentum quickly fizzled out. The project, that had been carefully crafted to honor Columbo and Falk's legacy, was left in limbo. In 2007, everything took a heartbreaking turn. Peter Falk's health started to deteriorate. After undergoing some dental surgeries, those closest to him began noticing small but alarming changes. His memory started slipping, and soon, the severity of the situation became clear. In 2008, Falk was publicly diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. By then, the signs were unmistakable. The man who had once portrayed a detective sharper than anyone on television could no longer remember being Columbo at all.
I love Columbo. I don't love Columbo any more than I love Rocky, though.
It wasn't long before it became clear that the long-awaited farewell episode would never happen. Falk's daughter later testified in court that her father no longer recognized familiar faces, including her own. By 2009, the plans for a final episode were officially off the table. Columbo's final case would never be filmed. In 2011, Peter Falk passed away at the age of 83 from complications related to pneumonia and Alzheimer's. His death marked the end of Columbo as both a character and a cultural phenomenon. For decades, fans thought they knew every corner of Columbo's world. But this lost episode proves there was still one case left unsolved, one that never made it to air, not because it lacked quality, but because it said too much. What started as just another mystery script turned into something networks were afraid to touch. And while the episode never aired, its existence tells its own story, a reminder that even television has its secrets.